Family Services of LA, correct? Is that right? And they are also doing a lot in the kind of food pantry and food insecure space. And it's been really interesting to see how they've had to adapt in terms of, like, I think Nancy told me yesterday that something like 90% of their volunteers, or 95% even, are over 65, immunocompromised, haven't been able to work. If I'm mixing that up about who told me that, I apologize. Anyway, those are my brief introductions. Eric, I'm going to start with you. If you can give us a bird's eye view of the kind of shifting that you've seen in the direct service part of the Jewish nonprofit world in terms of how people have adapted quickly in this moment. Give us a couple bullet points on that, and then we'll move on.
Sure. So thank you for having me. I just have to say I've been blown away by watching the agencies, some of whom are on this call as colleagues, and then across the 146 Federation communities and all the agencies they work with, because in many ways, almost overnight, their business and financial models just got thrown out the window. Right? Imagine that the way you did your work, you couldn't do anymore the same way, and the way you paid for your work, it wasn't gonna, be the same way. An entire shift, and it's been extraordinary. So, as you point out on the service side, of course, the biggest change, and it cuts across. Laura, I'm sure, can talk to us about food pantries, and Nancy maybe more about counseling and family services. They're more expert in it individually, those areas than I am. But whether it's food, whether it's seniors, whether it's counseling, shelters, everything that used to be about come to our center, come to our building, where we will serve you, has now had to be completely reoriented to either a delivery model or an online model. Online works for a nice Zoom like this. We can all get together in a way. We would have done this kind of conversation by Zoom anyway, right? Even before the crisis. But human services is about being with people and about the personal connection. And so whether it's, as I said, food deliveries, relationship, building that has to be outside the area, and then there's a huge spike in the need, right? Mental health needs of isolated families is just off the charts. So not only can you not deliver services the way you normally have, you have to find a different way to deliver it, and you're having this massive expansion. So they are doing things like, in Detroit, delivering meals twice a day to seniors, whereas the seniors used to come. Mobilizing staff to make phone calls to shut-ins, to isolated people. I'm shut-ins. We're all shut-ins, right? To isolated, seniors particularly, and others every day. Connecting, as I'm sure Cindy can talk more about, people to volunteer service, Hillels and Moishe houses, giving people things that they can do that are constructive. So that's on that side. I'll just say one word about the business model, the financial side, if I can. I know it wasn't your question exactly, but who would have ever thought in the same conversation that started with Ma'ot Chitim funds, we'd be talking about SBA, right? But truly, this is an entire sector that never thought in their life about applying for a government loan, or having a relationship with a bank, that would be a lender, or calculating the percentages that would be forgiven and not forgiven. This just to keep their employees paid, and vendors, basic vendor services so that they can serve. They've had to turn themselves into, essentially small business owners who are applying, through a government process. And as you mentioned, we've done everything we can to help them. We have volunteers that are working to train people how to do it. Banks that are helping to reach out. But they've had to completely rethink, how do we just avoid laying off our employees? How do we, JCCs, most 80% of fee-for-service model, all of a sudden just stops, right? They close the door and all the fees and they want to provide service. So those are the kinds of things that are happening out there.
Thanks, Eric. Nancy, can you pick up on that and actually just really tell us about how you did have to like go upside down in terms of the changes in the delivery that Eric was talking about. And then just to prep everyone, I would really love to hear everyone talk a little bit about the more the harder to touch parts of what Eric was talking about when human services can't be as human. How do you replace that human directness when there is that distance? So Nancy, but why don't you tell us a little bit about the major changes you've had to make and how you've worked with the transportation company and all that.
So first, thank you. Thanks to the Forward for hosting this conversation and including us in it. I am happy to share a screen with colleagues from across the country, which is something that is part of our new way of doing business. But it's really interesting because I think, Eric, you mentioned a lot of it, and we certainly have partnered closely both with JFNA and our local Jewish Federation on how we figure out how to respond. But at Jewish Family Service in Los Angeles, we really had to change our model of service delivery in the span of a few days. And while our domestic violence shelters continue operating, we had, multiple support groups that met in person. 8 of our support groups for domestic violence survivors are now being held via Zoom with, more secure logins and passwords, but trying to figure out how you provide that. Our counseling services and case management is all now being done through telehealth. Not only do not all of our clients have the capacity, but not all of our staff, our social workers and marriage and family therapists, did they have the skill set and technology? So we've had to look at how we deliver services differently. And as I think Eric mentioned, we have people who used to have a therapy session, counseling session once a week, every few weeks, and now they're wanting to talk to someone twice a week, 3 times a week because of the high levels of anxiety. You were correct when you mentioned at our food pantry, 95% of our volunteers are no longer coming in because they are not able to, because they are in high risk categories. And so how do we change our model when we are getting twice as many people who come seeking groceries? And so we have changed into, we now prepare bags of groceries with volunteers and staff who are wearing masks and gloves in our warehouse. And then we're handing out bags of groceries basically in our parking lot as people check in, and then we provide groceries, enough groceries for a week's worth of food per person in the household. And we also have kosher groceries available for those who need it. But we have had to change how we do that completely. And with the stay-at-home orders, safer at home here in Los Angeles, we're also looking at how do we deliver groceries to older adults who never needed our help before, but they can't get out and they can't get to us or to a market. And quite frankly, the grocery delivery services have not been able to manage the need out here. And I can tell you that my parents would not have groceries if it weren't for my sister and for me being able to go to the market on their behalf. They tried for 2 weeks to order online, cannot get them. And they are certainly in that age group. And so we've really had to look at changing everything about how we provide services.
I don't know who wants to jump in next, but I really want to hear you. You all are experiencing the essential same thing of like, I mean, all of us in all of our jobs, right? We are changing the way we interact with other humans. But I feel like the magic with which direct service nonprofits connected to some of the most vulnerable populations is such an amazing thing that all of you have spent your lives kind of working on, and to have that disrupted feels like such a hard challenge. And I wonder what you're seeing yourselves personally or with your employees and volunteers in terms of how they're coping with that, how they're readjusting in some of the ways Nancy talked about too.
Jody, I'll jump in.
Let's
Cindy,
go David, Cindy, Lara, just for.
Okay. Actually, I'm not experiencing what you described. If anything, we have accelerated the pace of what we were doing anyway, which is to try to move a lot of our lending online and to make it easier for people to access what we have without having to come into our office and do an in-person interview. So now we've moved all of that by necessity, onto video. And we're really different. We're not a human services organization in the same way. We make 0% interest loans to lower income New Yorkers. And our main job is to try to reach as many people as we can with financial resources. So in a weird way, this has just been an accelerant for us to put into place things which we have been working on and just needed to move toward faster. But I will tell you that we were already a mismatch for the need in New York City. And now it really feels like we are so outnumbered by people who need what we have to offer. We have increased the amount of lending that we're doing. We have stopped taking repayments from people who have current loans from us. And still, it feels like it is a drop in the bucket. And I know that many of my colleagues feel the same, because there is something larger happening here than I think all of us or most of us have experienced in our lifetimes. And that, I think, is the background against which all of us are working. And, we'll be creative to figure out how to handle doing things differently than we have before, but the scale of the impact on our institutions and on the people in our community is just enormous.
Cindy?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot at Repair the World about how when faced with a crisis, people often have the response of fight, flight, or freeze, right? That's the common response to crisis. And that as Jews, our response needs to be different. Our response to crisis is to do good. So I would propose that we add a fourth reaction to how we respond, and that is to do good in the world. And I've seen a couple of questions have come in on the Q&A, and I want to say that, look, I think on the one hand, you can look at social distancing as just the most massive and incredible demonstration of the Jewish value of caring for our neighbors that the world has ever seen, right? How incredible that we've basically paused the world to show that we care about the people, right? The most repeated mitzvah in the Torah, to care for strangers, to care for our neighbors, because we as the Jewish community know what it means to be strangers. The whole world is enacting that, and it's beautiful. And on the other hand, it's foundational, but it's not nearly enough. And I think we can sometimes feel paralyzed by the scope, by the magnitude of the crisis that's in front of us. But our tradition teaches us that just because we can't finish the job, it's our role to take a step. And what I would really encourage, I love these two questions that have come in on the Q&A, like, what can I do? How can I take action? And if there's one thing I want to say to the amazing community who's gathered together today, it's that each of us has something to contribute in this crisis beyond social distancing. There are desperate needs that need to be met in terms of volunteering in person. And we've seen across the country, we have 65 service partners that we work with in 9 communities. And we've seen that the food kitchens, the soup kitchens and food pantries are desperate for volunteers and have, for the most part, really put in very strict CDC guideline following regulations so that volunteers can continue to be helpful, especially young volunteers. Given that so many of the volunteers have historically been older, there's a real need right now for young people to be volunteering. Donating blood for those of us who have had COVID-19, donating plasma. So real opportunities to be volunteering in person. And there's also opportunities to be volunteering at home. So for those of us who can't leave, the Repair the World website, which I'll share with you, has more than 30 opportunities right now to volunteer virtually. We can do online tutoring, we can do check-in calls with isolated seniors. There are projects for families and for kids to send cards to healthcare workers and to isolated seniors. And of course, skilled volunteering. So especially for those people who find themselves out of work, who have time, more time on their hands, there are ways that they can be supporting nonprofits using the skills that they've developed professionally to be helping. And I would say most importantly is hyper-local volunteering. So really thinking carefully about who your neighbors are, right? Who's on your block, who's in your building, how you might support them. We've heard amazing, heartwarming stories of people tucking notes under the doors of their neighbors, offering their phone number, their email address to be of service to people who are in need of grocery runs, of any kind of care. And I think that that is just such an important thing for the Jewish community to be doing right now.
Thank you so much, Cindy. So Hillary Unell had asked what was on my mind as well, of like where to best find a tzedek project or a mitzvah project for her son who's preparing for his bar mitzvah in March. My children are b'nai mitzvah in November, and I have given them the assignment of finding a mitzvah project in coronavirus. So I'm very happy to hear the Repair the World website has those listings. We also had Robin Frisch ask pretty much the same question. So thank you for addressing those, and we will get those websites into the chat as soon as we can so that you all can have those resources. We'll also be following up for everyone on this call with an email that will have the video of this call if you want to share it with friends, and also whatever resources we mentioned that we think you'll need. So sorry to delay, Lara, but why don't you pick up from there and tell us a little bit about what you're seeing at Miriam's Kitchen?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in many ways, we're doing what we always do, but we're doing it differently, right? So we're usually serving about 150 folks for each meal in a big dining room, right, where we're building community. But we've had to move those meals outside. We've made them to-go meals. So the question is a good one, right? How do you build community when what used to be a room full of people is no longer possible? Similarly, we usually rely on 2,000 volunteers, right, to support our work and to get those meals made. And we suspended volunteer service about a month ago. So we're able to get it done, and it just means people working harder and longer a little bit on our team. So grateful to them. But it's also this remaining question, right? How do we keep engaging and building community with these 2,000 folks who are committed to the mission but aren't able to come in? And I think the last thing I'll say is, part of how we're showing up for people experiencing homelessness is just trying to do whatever we can to supply them with what they need. And sometimes that's not very glamorous, right? I mean, part of what we're seeing is that people need access to water and restrooms, right? We're all worried about our health and safety, but it's hard to wash your hands if you don't have a sink, and it's hard to stay home if you don't have one. So we rented a restroom trailer, the kind you might have seen at an outdoor fancy wedding, and we're renting that to make sure that people have 12-hour access to restrooms since they can't come in the building. And then we're trying to get creative where we can. So one thing we often offer under non-pandemic times is art therapy, to really create a space for people who have been through a lot of trauma, who are feeling isolated, to kind of connect with themselves or others through art. So we've started offering that by phone, and our art therapists are connecting with folks that have phones and kind of walking them through prompts to do art, which is really creative. And then similarly, we have a lot of clients that have recently moved into housing, but maybe had been outside on the streets for years, even decades, and they're feeling really isolated. So we're making sure that we're calling every single one and checking in with them to see both what they need in terms of phone and other urgent needs, but also just to say hi and make sure that folks have the opportunity to connect to Miriam's Kitchen, since that's a place they found a home.
Jody, can I add just one quick thing?
Sure.
Because your question, I loved all the positive answers. Your question was also about the stress on the employees, and there actually has been a question in the Q&A I saw about employees. I want to mention one particular sector, and that's the senior homes, because obviously federations, many communities have a Jewish senior home and an assisted living. There's an association of Jewish senior, I don't know what the exact acronym is, Jewish Homes of Aging. And of course, these places have been so extraordinarily impacted because their patients are the most vulnerable. Their families can't visit their families that are in the homes, and the stress on the workers who are in the home trying to provide care, and then trying to take care of their own families. So the stress on the workforce, particularly in the human services space, and it's certainly true at Nancy's organization, I know, is so high. And so, for example, we've had, like in Cleveland, they have been setting up, they've been giving out gift cards for food and groceries, and actually bringing groceries to give to home healthcare workers as they're leaving their shift, just to take home, so they don't have to go shopping. They can just go home to their families. And I just want to say, look, the fact is, we have this extraordinary professional field in Jewish human services and in Jewish life, education, and engagement. And you know, it's not gonna, they're not all gonna be able to stay employed, and you know, they're not all gonna be able to come back, you know, after the furloughs. This is gonna be a period of some retrenchment for many, many organizations. It's just a fact. It's gonna be a fact in business. It's gonna be a fact in nonprofits. So how we also care for our professional field, you asked, I want to say it's a high priority for us. Just we have you were citing resources. So on the SBA loans, jewishtogether.org is where you can get all the information about access them, which, by the way, even independent contractors are eligible for. So if you're a solo teacher who contracts, or a scholar that usually works on speaking fees and such, you're an independent contractor, just jewishtogether.org. And we also have a coalition of the major umbrella organizations. Sydney is a part of it, of our steering committee, you know, the JCCs and the Hillels and the day schools. So we're all working together to try to address these mega issues of employment and stress and all that. So thank you for letting me add that.
I feel like an unknown to me before, either benefit or perhaps problem with Zoom is that it may put moderators out of business, since you guys are all seeing the questions and answering them before I have a chance to raise them, but I'll worry about that later. Actually, I want to pick up on a couple of things people have been talking about. The first is about, I mean, Nancy, Lara, and Cindy, and all of you, but maybe you three in particular, you've all talked about the various ways, the kind of extraordinary lengths that you went to be focused on giving human dignity to some of the most vulnerable people, right? To how do you give homeless people, or people with serious food insecurity, or the survivors of domestic abuse, or people with major mental health problems, you know, really creating human dignity in your interactions with them. And I feel like that is such a key Jewish value of tikkun olam, and of the various, if you think of the ladder of charity, right, is to keep the dignity of every human kind of present and front. And yet I feel like this has really been challenging for that. Like, so I would love you to talk about how you've worked to maintain that aspect in your work, when some of the ways that you did it before, I forget who was talking about, you used to have the ability to pick out your own groceries at the food pantry, and now it's prepackaged. So, you know, before it was much more like a middle-class experience, and now it's a little bit more like a handout. And then the second question on my mind, and maybe is particularly for Rabbi Rosen to jump in on, is the way that this crisis has created whole new batches of clients, people who wouldn't think of themselves as needy are now needy. And how do you access that, give dignity to that, but also make them understand what services, how do you reach that whole new pool? I'm going to let whoever wants to dive into the first one.
I can jump in. I think, you know, part of what I think has made it a little bit of an easier transition for us is that dignity, and I'm sure this is true of the other organizations on the call, has just been a central pillar of how we do business since the beginning, right, as always. And so once you're in the practice of making sure that the dignity of the people that you're working with and serving is kind of just part of how you do your work, it's a little easier to make sure that's still in the center when you have to shift. And so, you know, that includes things for us, like, for example, the media is really interested in what Miriam's Kitchen is doing right now, for good reason. And that isn't always an easy thing, right? To be fielding cameras and reporters on site when we're already trying to kind of do social distancing and make sure that everyone is safe and well, and that they're at choice about whether they want to be on camera, right, or a part of news. But, you know, having had protocols kind of in place beforehand and all the time with media to think about how do we handle media and how do we empower our guests to kind of be a part of that process as much as they want to, made it so that, like, when all of a sudden there was this thing that the media was much more interested in, we were kind of prepared to handle it. So that's what I would offer.
I think I would add that parallel to the value of dignity, I think this moment also really calls upon us to think about the value of justice, and that it's not enough just to care for those who are in need, though that of course is an important piece of our tradition, but it's also, I think, a moment in which we need to just acknowledge that Black and Brown people are being disproportionately impacted, both by the virus and by the economic downturn in this country. And I think just parallel to the dignity issues, I think this moment is bringing light upon the issue that many of us have been working on now for years, which is acknowledging the ways in which our systems are disproportionately impacting Black and Brown people. And I think as we aim our service towards the Jewish community, we also need to acknowledge those who are in the most need in this moment, and
Yeah, I
really
think that's
look
really important
to our
too,
neighbors.
because the other thing that I think is happening, sort of naturally, right? But this time of intense stress also makes us sort of tribal and insular in a way, right? It's very hard to look far when everybody feels like they're under siege. I mean, and this is almost unique in our history, this idea that there's this thing happening that's actually affecting everyone. And at first it seemed like it was affecting everyone kind of equally, and now we're really seeing that it's not.
Well,
I saw you jumping in too, Nancy. Go ahead.
One aspect of that is access to these SBA loans it's become clear that if you don't have a pre-existing relationship with a lender, you're not going to have access in the same way or at all. And as Cindy was talking about, people, African-American communities have not had access to financial services in the same way that other Americans have. And it's a mess right now because the small business owners who are trying to access this resource that the government intends to help, keep small businesses afloat, they are not able to access it in the same way. And I want to just call out for excellence the work that JFNA has been doing on making it possible for the nonprofit structure that supports the Jewish community and that the Jewish community supports to figure out this really complicated and clunky program. It's just been outstanding, the work that they've been doing, both on the advocacy level to get the thing going in the first place and to make sure that everyone is included, but also just simply explaining how to access this. And at the same time, I want to note that we're lucky and privileged as a community to have something like JFNA. And there are thousands, tens of thousands of nonprofits and small businesses that are out there struggling on their own, trying to navigate this, and I'm sure not succeeding. So there is really an aspect in which the virus is a great leveler, and there's an aspect in which the virus just lays bare all the ways in which it's not a level playing field in our country.
So just to build on that, so that I can hopefully give some hope. First of all, David, thank you for the nice words, but we will stay at this until everyone has access to these resources, and I mean everyone, not just the Jewish community. So in fact, Cindy and I had a conversation just last night about, help us, all of you who have relationships with organizations, religious, churches, mosques, community centers that we might not have direct access to. We would not just love, we will just be honored and privileged to be able to help other communities access it. We've done some webinars for some churches and other faith groups. And we will remain open for business. Every email that you send to our SBA hotline, which is on jewishtogether.org, gets responded to. We know that our resources have gone out through United Ways and through other networks. But anyone who's listening to this webinar, please help us. It is absolutely a moment where we know that, as hard as it is for us to access banking resources, we at least, JFNA can pick up the phone and call banks, and we absolutely want to respond to the need that Rabbi Rosen has articulated. This is not going to be done overnight, right? There's a long line, so we're going to be in this for weeks, and we're going to get more money in the program hopefully this week. We've been advocating for a replenishment of the fund, which, knock on wood, is going to happen. And so we will keep at it. So help us help the communities that need help.
Thank you, Nancy. I know you've been trying to get in for a couple of rounds here, so over to you.
Thanks. I think a couple of points I want to add, partly an answer to your question, but also, something that that my co-partners have implied, this is not going to be a short-term term change in how we're delivering services. So I think the question of how we're learning to adapt, some we've had to do really quickly, and some is working really well. And some we've had to do quickly, and with this luxury of time and space and resources, we will likely adapt. But the value, the person-centered lens through which we provide services here in Los Angeles, and I will say our client base looks like our city. So we serve everybody. And that lens doesn't change regardless of how the technology has changed. And so that focus is going to be with us. It's been with us for 165 years. It's going to continue. You know, we adapt, we change, we meet the needs of our time. So I think that's part of how we keep doing it with, as you said, respecting and valuing individual dignity. But I also think if you look at, we are the largest provider of services to Holocaust survivors on the West Coast. And what we're doing, you know, we are now doing interactive activities through essentially a Zoom platform. It's more interactive, but with Holocaust survivors. We are obviously home delivering meals to people who used to come in for meals 5 days a week. We are, we've had a 40% increase so far in the amount of meals we're delivering to seniors. But we are looking at doubling the number of people at our food pantry. And so, and the number of calls to our intake and social work lines, we can't even keep track. It's unbelievable how many people are calling. But we are doing it as part of a community. And, you know, people have asked how they can help and how they can participate. And truly, our volunteers are our lifelines. And I know people don't want to be told that we need money, but, you know, donations are critical right now for all of our agencies, but so is advocacy. You know, JFNA has done this amazing job leading the charge on ensuring that nonprofits, and in my case, Medicaid recipient agencies were eligible. But our board members, our volunteers, our staff made phone calls to our senators and to our members of Congress and said again and again and again how important this is for us as an agency to provide services. So there's a through line in the volunteering that is, it's the volunteering, it's the direct service, it's the giving money, it's the calling your members, advocating locally. Our state has been particularly proactive. And so we're reaching out to our state legislators as well. And I've got board members who are calling state legislators saying, hey, you know, we need funds for all of these things you want us to be doing.
Great work. Keep it up.
First of all, I want to invite everybody to submit their questions through the Q&A if you have them. A quick one from Judith Arndt, which I think Lara may know the answer to, is, are there hotels that are vacant that are now offering any rooms for the homeless? I've definitely read about offering rooms for healthcare workers, but are some hotels becoming like homeless shelters?
Yeah, so in DC at least, we, our local Department of Human Services is working with hotels for a few things. I mean, one is that we already actually were using hotels for shelters to meet our existing shelter capacity. But right now what's happening is that, you know, we had a bunch of people living in shelter who were not sick, but are medically vulnerable, right? People who are over the age of 70 or 80 years old, already have kind of underlying health conditions. So they were able to kind of identify those that were at high risk and to move them to remote sites as a prevention mechanism, right? Knowing that those folks would be at high risk should they contract the virus. And at the same time, right, they're using hotels as quarantine sites, right? So as we've had occasional positive test cases for people that are living in shelter or other kind of congregate settings, they're able to kind of do contact tracing to figure out kind of who has this person been in close contact with, and then making sure we can move all those folks to remote sites so that they can be, you know, sheltering in place and, you know, preserving their safety and the safety of others, and then getting kind of the food and healthcare and services that they need.
David, I want to turn back to you for something that it's a little narrower, but I'm just really intrigued by it. And I want to just talk about the kind of concept, the particular idea of a loan, of a no interest loan as a organizing principle for the organization. And I know that you, in your prior jobs, did a different kind of thing, right? And I'm interested both in whether there are parallel organizations that are not in the Jewish community that similarly have a similar kind of structure around them. And if you could just talk a little bit about where you think that particular approach kind of fits in the Jewish Tikkun Olam system, and why it's appealing to you, why what you think the particular, and it feels also like this moment when so many people are kind of newly vulnerable, and I think we hope temporarily vulnerable, that this idea of a no interest loan may have more life to it.
Sure. There are lots of microfinance organizations in the world and in the United States. Very few of them lend at 0%. That seems to be a distinctively Jewish approach, although we're not the only faith community even that has a commitment to lending without interest. Muslims also do this, and Christians aren't so fond of usury, but they don't insist on 0%. I think the idea of a loan as the sort of highest form of tzedakah, together with helping somebody find employment or going into business with them, is that it's a partnership, and it allows somebody to feel as though they are on the receiving end of some support, but also in there with the lender, doing their share. And so when somebody receives a cash transfer that they need, they should take it because they need it, and we believe in everybody having access to basic needs. But another way to receive support, and sometimes one that feels better to people, is to borrow and then be able to pay back as they're able to do that. I will say that one unique aspect of how we lend at the Hebrew Free Loan Society, and there are about 40 Hebrew Free Loans all around the country. You probably have one in your city, wherever you are. We don't lend based on credit scores. We don't lend based on taking collateral from people. That's not how we secure our loans. We lend through mobilizing community relationships. When somebody comes to us to borrow, they have to bring a guarantor or two guarantors. These are people in their life who say, I will pay this loan off if the borrower doesn't pay. And it creates a whole bond of accountability between the borrower and the guarantor, and it results in our organization having a 99.9% repayment rate. And we're lending to people who are financially, not that stable, and yet they pay us back at an incredibly high rate. I think that not only does that prove that you could actually provide for the financial needs of lower income people without charging them an arm and a leg. Whenever a for-profit lender says, oh, I have to price in the risk, I say, I don't know, I've been lending, I'm in an organization that's been lending for 128 years. We have a 99.9% repayment rate. I think you're pricing in something else. Maybe it's profit, which is fine. I'm not against profit. You can lend on profit, but if your mission is to help lower income people stabilize and advance, then you can do it without charging exorbitant rates for credit. And I think that the system of free loans that the Jewish community has supported for centuries is an amazing resource that we ought to be exporting in many, many other contexts. I would like when we get out of this mess and employers are able to think about the financial health of their employees and not just about how to keep their employees employed, I think there ought to be standard that every employer offers interest-free loans to their employees out of a pool of capital that they set aside for this purpose, because it's a benefit that their employees ought to have and a way to get over the inevitable financial bumps that there are. This could be something that is all over the place in American capitalism. And that's one of the things I'm gonna be working on after we get to the other side of this.
That sounds great. It sounds like an op-ed you should write for the Forward. I wanted to, so Lois Zuckerman in the Q&A asked about how your organization is managing its employees during the pandemic. And Eric has talked a little bit about how many nonprofits, particularly JCCs, and the Forward wrote about this a couple days last week, I guess, have had to have significant layoffs or furloughs. So I'm interested in people can answer that question, but I also wanted to extend it a little bit to talk about you yourselves as kind of leaders of organizations. I feel like there's been quite a lot of conversation around how can we support the first responders and the healthcare workers who are under so much stress and putting themselves at risk. But you guys have talked a little bit about how we know this is going to be a long-lasting crisis, and I just wonder, like, if you could talk both about your employees and your own kind of, like, how can we support you in this crisis, basically? Anyone?
I can jump in. I think, we talked already about donating, but I think it is like a good reminder that donations go not just to kind of the vulnerable populations we're talking about today, but they also help us keep the lights on, right, and pay our staff and give our staff leave. So just want to underscore that. And I think also, it, like anything else, like you said, it's a marathon. So we have to be creative and strike balance, So I think for our team, what that looks like is at the leadership level, we're both making sure that some of us are on site every day and kind of being in solidarity with the frontline workers that are there, cooking in the kitchen and serving meals to our guests. But also that some of us are staying home, even if we could come in, to kind of show everybody else that it's okay to do work from home if you can, that can be a way that you're keeping yourself safe, your family safe, and kind of flattening the curve. And also just normalizing things like self-care, like occasionally taking a day off. We all are working really hard and around the clock because the work is always urgent, and it's even more urgent now. But at the same time, we can, just like we would another time, take a half day off, take a break, eat lunch, right? All these things that are easy to forget to do when you're at home in your sweatpants, kind of working from your computer. So that's what I would add.
Can I add that?
Please.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Sorry, Eric.
No, please.
I have to say that, and I'm sure this is true for others, but we have the best board of directors on the planet. You all may have good ones, but ours is the best. And honestly, what they have done really does help in that, because they have, our board chair hopped on, we had an all staff Zoom last week, and about 180 of our staff were on it. And our board chair came on, she talked about how much our work means to her. And she stayed on and answered questions, and she was just there for everybody. And the board has made it clear to the staff how much they appreciate what we're doing. We're sending out grocery gift cards to all staff this week as just a thanks. But it is a hard question. We also are sending out employee assistance program information. We are opening up our counseling and case management lines to staff, because we know we have staff who are impacted by not just the virus, but the economic downturn and the layoffs, and their family members, and the everyone who is now homeschooling on top of it. So we're trying to make those resources available.
I just wanted to say a word on behalf of the executives of the agencies. I work with 146 Federation executives. I also have the privilege of knowing many people like Nancy who run the agencies that provide the service in the communities, as well as the national leaders like Cindy. These are people under, first of all, they're unbelievably committed, dedicated, hardworking people under normal circumstances. They are now working round the clock, sitting in front of these, these Zooms, trying to rally people, trying to manage the kinds of business decisions that we were discussing earlier that just a month ago would never, ever have occurred to them, to have to deal with, making the most challenging decisions of all about how to keep the organizations open and surviving, making decisions about what to do with employees, that like the question that was asked. These are just traumatic decisions for, for the executive directors and CEOs who have this burden on their shoulder, not to mention the fact that most of them also have families at home. They have parents in nursing homes. They've got young kids who they're trying to homeschool. I've seen performance at such a level, and I know there's stress with it, that we have to reach out and make sure that the people who are running these enterprises know that we care about them and that we're thinking about them.
Thank you, Eric. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to thank everybody again for being here and let you know, if you're a participant on the call, that we're going to sign you up for a free either month or 3-month subscription to the Forward, I forget which. And I want to thank very much Lisa Lepson and Dina Cooperman for, it's 1 month of a subscription, I've been told. I want to thank Lisa Lepson and Dina Cooperman for helping to organize this Zoominar. And please do tell your friends. We have another one coming up on Tuesday. Actually, we're going to not have it be about coronavirus, but our opinion editor, Batya Ungar-Sargon, is moderating a debate between 2 of our columnists over whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So happy that we can get back to the perennial questions that are dogging our community. It's at noon on the 21st, not 2 o'clock. I'm making all kinds of mistakes. I hope you'll all forgive me. I apologize. What I want to do in our last few minutes is partly, look, I want everybody to really walk away with a sense of what they can do to get involved and to help and to be part of the amazing Tikkun Olam work that you are leading and that is so critical to our community. So I think we started the call really focused on that, and we've shared these resources in the chat of literally things, ways, links for people to jump on, and that's what I'm going to do when I get off the call. But what I would love for each of you to share, and I know you've got them like in spades, is just an anecdote, an example that you've seen either within your organization or not, that you, even if it's something you read about or whatever, of someone who just did something really creative, really extraordinary. Maybe it was really simple, that like really met this moment with the spirit of Tikkun Olam and of direct helping. I feel like you guys see the stuff, and I want you to share it to help inspire us. So that's your assignment. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. My colleague in Chicago organized a Shabbat dinner for a group of friends and people who she knew through her work in the organization. And they enjoyed a beautiful Shabbat meal, in isolation via Zoom with Shabbat ritual. And they paused in the middle of the dinner. And she shared with each of them an outline for a letter that they could use to reach out to their neighbors. And all together as a group, they each printed out 20 or 30 copies of this letter, where they wrote in their name and their phone number and offered to be of assistance to their neighbors. And when the dinner concluded, they each committed to going out and distributing the letters underneath the doors of their neighbors.
So cool. Okay, who's next?
Well, I'm going to break the rule just a little bit, because the thing that I do want people to know, it's besides my job, it's my passion, is federations have been around for 100 years, and sometimes you don't notice them or what they do in a community, but it's at moments like this when you do notice them. Sometimes you're annoyed by those annual campaign calls or those Super Sunday calls, and you're not sure why. And it's moments like this when you do know it. Just the Federation of New York, UJA Federation of New York, has gone into their endowment now for over $45 million, just taken it out and spent it, given it to agencies, kept the doors open, kept the camps open, forgiven rent to JCCs. I mean, everything. It's just extraordinary. Every day I talk to them, they just made another, the board convened again to make another set of loans, another set of grants. And of course, this is happening. New York's the largest, it's the largest Jewish community, the largest federation. So I use that as an example, but this is of course happening all across the country, in every community. And so my answer to how you can help is, if it's been a long time, or if you didn't ever know, where your federation was in your community or how to reach them, this is a great time to reach out and say, Hineni, here I am, as a volunteer, as part of our community. And I know they'll know how to put it to work. You can always find your federation both through jewishtogether.org or through jfna.org. But just be part of the community. Alti Ferosh Minat Zibur, right? Hillel taught, don't separate yourself from the community. Now's the time to lean into the community. And we
know people can both write checks and write letters. They can do both. So what else? Nancy, you want to go?
Sure. We've talked a lot about food. We'll keep talking about food. But one of the things that's the fallout from people, I don't know about your communities, but in ours, where people are hoarding food from the grocery stores, canned goods and others, despite the fact that we know that there is plenty of food. If you have done that and you realize you no longer need 800 cans of particular food, beans, any kinds of proteins, any kinds of food, think about contributing them to your local food pantry or food bank. We rely on a huge amount of grocery store overage at our pantries, and there is no overage right now. So that means we're going to end up having to buy more food. So go through your pantry. It's a great quarantine activity. Clean out your pantry, not all the expired icky stuff, but
and Nancy, is there a good resource, a good national website clearinghouse to find a local pantry near you?
Feeding America.
Feeding America. Okay, great.
Feeding
so Lara
America
and David, just again, I'd love you to share just one anecdote of something that you've seen happen that you thought was really creative or cool or generous. Lara, you go first, and then we'll give the rabbi the last word because he's a rabbi.
I mean, one thing that we see all year round, but are seeing a lot right now that it continues to be inspiring, is that a lot of the advocacy here locally is being led by people with lived experience of homelessness or people that are still experiencing homelessness. And, sometimes without access to internet or phone, folks are raising their voice, and even folks who have very little or nothing are looking out for other folks that are going through what they've been through or what they're going through. And so, with that kind of anecdote and a shout out to their leadership, I would just, encourage folks to think about how you can raise your voice. Advocacy doesn't have to be a dirty word. And, a guest advocate that I work closely with, Walden Adams, he says, advocacy is really just caring about something and then telling someone you care. And I think that's just a great framing for it, that we all have a voice, and in whatever way feels comfortable for us, raise that voice in the way that you might for any other thing that you care about.
David.
So I want to full-throatedly endorse everything everybody said, especially the last point about advocacy. I also want to say you should pay your folks. If you are in a position to have somebody who cleans your house but can't come over, and you are able to pay that person even though they're not coming, you should do that, because they are depending upon you. And that goes for nannies, and it goes for lots of people who are, sort of out there wondering where the next rent payment or grocery bill is going to come from. I want to say that I think people are looking for meaning in all of this, and I think that's entirely natural. I also think it's risky, and I think that it's difficult, and it's probably also too soon. I think that the meaning of events takes time to unfold, not just because we need some distance from something to understand it, but because the meaning of something emerges from the way that we respond to it and how it leads all of us to change our lives. I ask myself, are we going to become more fearful and separated because of all of this, or less fearful and more connected? Are we going to try to get back to some sort of before all this happened, which frankly had a lot of problems? Our society was not perfect before all this happened. Or are we going to try to work to shape a world that somehow honors the pain and the suffering we are all going through, and acknowledges that there are just huge social fissures that are laid bare by the virus and are having really different impacts on different communities. I think the choices that we make.
Hi, everyone. This is Dan Levinson, and welcome to.
Are going to be decisive in establishing the meaning of the pandemic. I can't imagine going through something like this and not having it change us and not having it make us want to change things.
The Oral Talmud with B'nai Lappi, who I think will appear in a moment. There she is. And me, Dan Levinson. So we mentioned this last week.
So if you don't want this to be meaningless, I think everyone should pick one thing that the pandemic has made them realize needs to change, and you should commit.
We found out that our name that we had picked for this show, which was pretty random, Talking Talmud, it was pretty straightforward. Turns out that that was the name of a Talmud podcast. So we immediately said we need to change
seriously to working on changing that one thing. And I guarantee that whatever you achieve will change the meaning of all of this for you. And if all of us do that,
then try to crowdsource the name and ask our listeners or watchers what name we should have, and we got nothing. So we decided that we're going to have to do this ourselves. What else is new? And we came up with the name.
Changes the meaning of all of this for the history books.
Well done, Rabbi Rosen. Thank you for that. Is a really inspiring and thoughtful way to end.
I would say that I spammed you with many texts of all kinds of different names. And one of those names that stuck was called the Oral Talmud. And we're pretty excited.
What I love about your having spammed me was that, you know how only a few.
And thanks to all of you, Nancy Volpert, Lara Pukach, Cindy Greenberg, and Eric Fingerhut. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to all of our participants. We'll hope we'll see you next week at our
texts that you get appear before you actually click on it. Then you see all the text one after the other. The only one that appeared on my telephone screen was Oral Torah.
Zoom on Tuesday at noon. And I hope you'll keep reading the forward. Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Jody.
Thank you. Great to see everyone.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
To myself, no, Oral Talmud, that's it, Oral Talmud. And then when I clicked on the phone, one of the subsequent texts you'd already written said, Oral Talmud, how about that? So I think it was Bashert.
Yeah, by the way, that's pretty much how the name Judaism Unbound came about. Basically, I was spamming my team with all kinds of names, and they loved Judaism Unbound. And I said, doesn't sound serious enough. Is that really, and anyway, I guess that's the way to do it. So the Oral Talmud it is. And I guess that when I was spamming you with those ideas, the idea that was in my head was that the way that the Talmud characterizes itself is that essentially, and we talked a little bit about the Sinai moment last week. We're going to keep talking about it because, like we said last week, that it's an important moment in the rabbi's imagination in the Talmud. And they had this story that at the Mount Sinai, not only was the Ten Commandments given, not only was the Torah given, whatever that means exactly, but there was also, but they said that what we think of as the Torah, that's the written Torah. There was another Torah that was given at Mount Sinai called the Oral Torah, and that Oral Torah was oral, right? And now X hundreds, thousands of years later, people are going to forget it. It's really important. We're in exile. We better write it down. So that's the story of the Talmud. It's the attempt to write down the Oral Torah, right? And where I was going with it was, we're very much inspired, you and I both, by Yitz Greenberg and his idea that we are on the cusp of or have gone into a third era of Judaism. There was the biblical era, then the rabbinic era, and now the sort of post-rabbinic era. And it really feels to me, and we've been talking about this, that we've just undergone some kind of exodus, some kind of sudden exodus from where we were. And here we are milling around in the wilderness. And it seems like the third era is pretty close. And so if we were to do what the rabbis were doing back then, we would have to imagine that there was actually a third Torah given at Sinai. And so, it was like maybe there was like but what would it be called? That was where my head was going. So there's the written Torah, the oral Torah, and what's the other Torah? So, and I think that what you've been saying all along, at least as I've understood it, is that the other Torah is what you call svara, which is a word from the Talmud that maybe you could explain a little bit.
Yeah. What I see in the tradition the rabbis essentially invented, but which they retrojected back into God's mouth at Mount Sinai, which was a great, I think, sales technique, great marketing on their part. So that's my theology. It was a radically new tradition that they gave themselves permission to create by expanding the places where they could reliably find God's will. And this is an insight that I learned from my teacher, David Kramer, that the rabbinic revolution was actually a revolution in human thought, not just Jewish thought, which was that where you could go to find out what God wants of you is not just your scripture, but for the rabbis, it was also svara. It was this inner sense of moral intuition, which we all have the seed of, that we all have the ability to cultivate and refine. And they believe it can be refined in learning and lots of other ways, but that ultimately that could be a source of truth and of innovation and of retelling and of improving and upgrading the tradition that we inherited. So this quote unquote oral Torah that they portrayed as having come down from God was really quite a radical retelling, one that I claim would have been unrecognizable to the Jews of the written Torah before them. And as you really put it, I think so beautifully, the rabbis want, and I believe it too, but you say it better. And that is that the rabbis want us to do to them what they did to God. In other words, or what they did to Torah. They are showing us the tools, the mechanisms, the fact that the tradition is about radically retelling in order to achieve our ultimate goals. And here, go ahead and do it where and when you see fit. And I think we're there.
Yeah, and I think that the only piece that I want to add is that I think that, what I was getting at was like svara, the way that you just explained it, this deep moral intuition. It's like, I think that's the third layer, right? Because if something is written and then something is sort of passed down orally, the other thing is passed down almost like meta orally. I mean, by role modeling, by example, by these ways that are other than oral, and that I think fundamentally make up what we know as intuition, what we know as wisdom, right? And so
sorry, go ahead.
No, so I was just saying, so I think that some version of that is the third layer that we can say was also given at Sinai, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what I was trying to get at with the idea of the oral Torah, so that we ended up being the oral Talmud. And I think that what I was trying to get at with the concept of the oral Talmud, I don't know that it fully gets there, at least one layer of it, is that it's an English translation of svara, right? There's something, it's not quite, but there was something that I was like trying to get at there that was saying like, how do we say, well, what this really is, if the Talmud is the oral Torah, then the oral Talmud must be, that intuition, right? So I'm trying to get at the same concept. At least that was what was going on in my mind.
Yeah.
The other thing, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, svara is what drove oral Torah, and it's the constant actually that remains no matter what the tradition looks like. When you bring your svara to bear on it, I think it's what becomes the unchanging eternal concept. Not that svara is unchanging, and people can disagree about their svaras, but the idea that svara is where our truths come from ultimately, I think is the eternal Torah.
Well, and you talk about, I mean, I think I got this from you, so I'm just trying to reflect it back to you, so you tell me if I've got it wrong, but like, I think that what's interesting is that you could critique this idea that, oh, the rabbis made up this oral Torah, it wasn't really given, right? But no, I think that what they're saying is that it's almost fundamental to the written Torah. It has to be some kind of oral Torah. Right? We know even that the written Torah was an oral tradition before it was written down. So the point isn't that it's oral. The point is that it's coming from a deeper well of knowledge, wisdom, principle, intuition, and that kind of goes into different forms over time, including a written form. And so you've explained to me that the rabbis, and I think David Kramer explained to you, and who's our guest for next week, that the rabbis had this idea of svara, and that svara, meaning moral intuition, trumps even something that's written in the Torah as a source of law. So if you have a deep sense that something, and we'll study some texts of this nature later on, but if you have a sense that something is just deeply wrong that is in the Torah, that it would offend your moral intuition on such a deep level, then actually at least the rabbis themselves said that svara, one's moral intuition, can tell you to not do that thing in the Torah. I mean, in their case, it was rare instances, but we can sort of amplify. And what that means on a fundamental level, to my mind, is that svara is an even deeper well of source, of meaning, than the oral tradition, which was an even deeper well than the written tradition. And so it may be that we're saying we're adding a third layer onto what was given at Sinai, but actually we're not adding a third layer. We're actually almost digging up a third layer that was, of course, always there in both of the other layers, something like that.
I love that. I think you're absolutely right. For the rabbis to say that which comes out of your svara can trump Torah, they're essentially suggesting to, hamevin yavin, to those who can tolerate the radicalness of it, that Torah itself, the Torah itself, came out of svara, that it was a product of svara from the get-go. Yeah.
I want to raise one more valence of the Oral Talmud before we move on to today's text, because it was something that you were saying before we came on the air, and I've been mulling it over, and I think there's something deep in it that we should bring forward to our listeners, to our watchers, and kind of engage people in thinking about this, that in these periods of transition, whether it's the wilderness in the desert after the Exodus from Egypt, or the period after the destruction of the Second Temple, there's this period between the Exodus and the, let's say, arrival in the promised land of some kind. There's a period in between, and we could call that the wilderness period. We can call that, it's a period of chaos and it's scary, but it's also a period of creativity towards this ultimate place that we're going to get to. In the myth, it's either, you could think of it as 7 weeks in the wilderness before we get to Sinai. You could think of it as 40 years in the wilderness before we get to the land of Canaan. Pick one, whichever myth drives you more. And in the Talmudic period, whether that's a myth or historical fact, it's a little closer to history, but also a lot of myth there, that it's this period maybe from the destruction of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was a later period than the destruction of the Second Temple. Between that period, which is about 135, I think, and the year 200, when Rabban Yehuda HaNasi wrote down the Mishnah. And so he wrote down the Mishnah in the year 200. That was kind of the first book of the Talmud. So what was happening in those 65 years in between? And you years ago, you talked to me, well, he must have been traveling around the country and the world saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? Like, this is such a crazy time. Like, we need to find out, and he kind of
I actually imagine him collecting faxes. This was when faxes was the height of technology. I imagine him faxing all of his buddies and all the little yeshiva groupings. Tell me what you do on Shabbos. Tell me what you do on Hanukkah. Tell me what you do when two people find a garment and they each claim, oh, right.
And so it feels like if we're in a similar time, like, right, this is not the written New Talmud yet, right? But maybe it is the oral New Talmud, in the sense that it's this period where we're going around, and I'm doing it with my friends, other people doing it with their friends, right? I've made some kind of internet video thing, so when I talk to my friends, other people can see it, but there's probably all kinds of things going on elsewhere. And we're really just kind of going around to the people that we really respect. And not that we respect what they were doing before this crisis, but we also really respect what they're doing now. And we're saying, like, what are you doing? You know, that let's, and so I just want to raise that as another valence that I was certainly not thinking about when I was spamming you the other night. But but that's also what happened with the name Judaism Unbound, was we started to see, wait a second, there's really something in this name. So, you know, those are some of the things that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I'm very inspired. You know, you and I have been talking for years about, you know, let's finally start working on the mission. What's it going to look like? What does it need to say? How would we structure it if we were to write another one? And all of a sudden I realized that what we're all doing in this moment right now is collecting, is what the Mishnah, the new Mishnah will be edited from,
right?
I think.
Okay, so let's jump into this text, because this is a very fundamental text. It has been a very fundamental text for...
Oh, okay, wait a minute. I got another idea. Another idea. Okay, yeah. So if the Mishnah literally means 2.0, right? It was like Torah 2.0, great name.
Because it comes like from the root of sheni, like the second thing. So
right.
It's 2.0.
Right. Yeah. So they called this, like, all this stuff they were collecting from their buddies. That was Torah 2.0. So we can't call the next one Mishnah. It would have to be something like Shlisha or something like that.
Right.
I don't know.
Mishlush. I don't know.
Yeah,
we'll
right.
Work on that.
What's the noun form? Okay, well, yeah, we'll have to work on that. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, well, you're the linguist. You know, okay, you work on that one. We'll bring that back next week. No, next week we have David Kramer. We're going to be a little more serious, but the week after we're going to come back to that. Okay, so so we're gonna, this text that we want to study today and look at today and think through today is known as the Avon of Achnai story. It comes from the tractate of Talmud called Bava Metzia. It starts on page 59a, but the meaty part is on 59b, and it's kind of like one of the most famous texts in liberal Judaism, and we'll see why as we study it. That there's reasons why, you know, liberal, by which I mean, you know, Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist, renewal, rabbis like that, people of those events have liked this text for a long time. I think that there's layers that those folks might not even like that we're going to dig up some today. And so I think this is a very potentially radical text. And the one framing that I want to give on it, which is not a framing that I have consciously used before in this text, but it does flow directly from our conversation last week, where, like you were saying earlier, we concluded that the rabbis must have been leaving us a message that says, please do to us what we did to God, in the sense that we that we took, or, you know, not even God, whoever, you know, put the Torah together, you know, we kind of played fast and loose with what they were saying directly. And we understand that means you're going to do that to us, and we want you to. And we talked last week, you can go back to last week's episode to dig deep into why we had that hypothesis. But I want to build on that and say, in this story, reading it through our eyes, I think we have to at least give it a reading where, when God appears in this story, it's not God, it's the rabbis. And so I don't want to give too much away because we haven't read the story, but we should read it on two layers. One is the layer as it's written, which is that God has a certain involvement. But the other is, let's say it didn't say God, let's say it said the tradition or the rabbi's views or something like that. And I think it'll be interesting to look at it in both of those ways. So B'nai, you want to kind of set the scene for us and give us a sense of what this text, where it comes from, what it's all about?
Yeah. So before we dive into the text, I think it's important, it'll add another layer just to get on the table where it's sitting in the Talmud and what's just happened before it. So the tractate of Talmud that this story appears in is, as you said, Bava Metzia. And what's funny about this story appearing in Bava Metzia is that Bava Metzia is about labor relations, employment law. It's a lot of business law. But all of a sudden, out of many, many, many pages of discussion about business law and misrepresentation and cheating in business, comes this Mishnah that talks about verbal wronging. And it basically makes the connection that just as financial wronging in business is very real and punishable, and it causes actual harm, verbal wronging actually causes harm too. And don't go around saying, you know, sticks and stones. Verbal wronging is for real. And it gives a number of examples. You know, you shouldn't go into a store and ask the price of an item that you have no intention of buying, you know, because it might cause the shopkeeper to get his hopes up and then be disappointed. And you shouldn't remind someone who's converted or whose parents converted what their life was like before they converted. And someone who's done tshuva, you shouldn't remind them of the thing they used to do. So it gives a number of examples of verbal wronging. And then the Gemara after that, the elaboration on that Mishnah goes into how bad hurting someone with words is. And the rabbis finally arrive at this idea that ever since the temple was destroyed, the gates of all the gates to God, to heaven, have been closed, except for one gate. And there's only one way now to really reach God and have God immediately respond, and that's through crying out from the pain of having been hurt through words. And that's really the setup to this story. So so leave that as a big frame, because in that context, there's another layer of understanding what's really going on in the story, or why this story is particularly here in this book, this volume on this page. Okay.
Okay.
So now I'll hand it back to you.
Well, okay. So first of all, I mean, when those connections come up, please point them out to me, because I didn't realize that, and I hadn't been reading it in that light. So that'll be very interesting for me, and hopefully for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's the surface take of the story. Okay.
Okay. So just to set a little bit of scene setting, only in the sense of like, what are we even talking about? And maybe it matters a little. It doesn't really matter, but at the same time, I mean, it doesn't really matter for, I think, the main part of our discussion, but at the same time, like, let's make it clear that there's a bunch of rabbis here that are arguing over a matter of Jewish law, a matter of halacha. We could translate it other than law, but basically it's a legal question whether a certain kind of oven is pure or impure, or has the capacity to become pure or impure. And the fundamental idea, as I understand it, is that things can only be ritually impure if they are a usable vessel of some kind, a usable tool. Right, but it has to be whole. It has to be a tool. Like if it's just a pile of stuff, it can't become impure. It has to be something that could have been used. And then the question is if it's pure or impure. So if it's just like a pile of garbage, then it's not impure. And so the question is, if there's an oven that was impure or could have been impure, and we say, hey, we have a clever idea. We don't know if this oven is pure or impure, could have been impure. Let's actually take it apart. Then when it's in pieces, we know that it's pure, because nothing can be impure if it's just a pile of junk. And then let's kind of put it together again, maybe in a different way with a little bit of sand in between. There's all kinds of, but the clever notion is kind of, can we somehow transform its and make it kind of into something that's pure, or that maybe even couldn't be impure, you know, by somehow reconstructing it so it still works just like an oven. It still does what an oven does, but some clever way we've made it. So it's almost actually in a way it does relate to the rest of the story, because in a way it's sort of saying, can we kind of fool God a little bit, you know, by saying, if we could just take this oven and take it apart and put it back together another way, then maybe, you know, we've kind of found a way around God's rules about purity, something like that. Is that a fair description?
Yeah. For me, it's about, can you fundamentally change something which from the outside looks and functions and appears in its old way? And is this new thing now what it used to be? What it appears to be? In any case, I think the issue isn't so much, is the oven pure or impure? It's, is it impurifiable? I always imagine that the backstory here is that there was this really clever oven inventor who thought, I'm going to make $1 million or whatever their money
$1 million dinars.
And we're going to make $1 million dinars by selling an impurity proof oven. Everyone's going to buy this oven because everyone knows that if a creepy crawly dies in their oven, they're going to have to break apart the oven and go out and buy a new oven, which probably was expensive. So if you buy this oven, which is going to be costly, but it's going to be the only oven you ever have to buy. And it's impurity proof because it's been chopped up and re-put back together. So it functions like an oven because it's in pieces, though it's not impurity, not impure. What's the word?
Impurifiable.
Yeah,
I think it's what you said.
It can't be made impure. You're going to buy that oven. And Rabbi Eliezer's like, we're going to meet him in a minute. He's like the front guy for this oven. He's like the guy who says, yeah.
He had stuck in it.
Exactly. He's got skin in the game. He's like an investor in this company. And he says, yeah, this oven is impurity proof because it's been chopped up and it's no longer whole. And okay, great.
By the way, I just want to note, I don't know if this is relevant at all, but I just had I just have ordered all this new like coffee making supplies because I figure I'm going to be stuck in my house for months. I might as well enjoy making coffee in new ways. So I don't know if it's relevant exactly, but I'm thinking about, it was pretty expensive. And, if there was one that like, was sold to me, like it wasn't going to break or anything, that's real value in a time like this. Right?
Exactly. I don't know what the analogy is, but I'm also getting Teflon. This is like the first Teflon. I don't know. There's something there.
Got it.
Okay.
So
anyway.
Oh, do you? So yeah. Okay. So now I think it's valuable just to introduce a couple of the characters quickly because there's two main characters in the story, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua, and I think
wait. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Let's remember that the first story we learned, the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai getting snuck out of Jerusalem to join the sages who were already in Yavne. I don't think we mentioned it at the time, but the two students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai who held his coffin or his body were Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua.
Right.
The two guys who.
So they're the two main students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and
who have very different approaches.
Sort of represent two different poles, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, Rabbi Eliezer tends to represent the more conservative voice, and Rabbi Joshua tends to represent the more creative, the less conservative voice. What's interesting is that Rabbi Eliezer is known in the Talmud as a plastered cistern that doesn't lose a plastered cistern that doesn't lose a single drop. And I think that the way that we can interpret that in our language is his mind was like a steel trap, right? Nothing got out of his mind. He remembered everything. So a man who remembers everything most likely will be conservative, right? Because he knows how it used to be. Whereas a person who has a less good memory might be more likely to be liberal because I don't even remember what it used to be. So why should I be stopped by these rules? I don't even remember the rules, right? So what's interesting in this story, though, is that at least as far as this, I mean, the reason why we might, I don't want to cast aspersions on Rabbi Eliezer, but the reason why we might imagine that maybe he owns stock in the oven company is because he's coming up with a ruling that's unusual for him, right? He's giving this ruling that says this oven is, super, can't be impure, right? And he would be the kind of guy that would more likely want to say, no, we got to be careful about these kinds of things.
Although I think him having stock in this company and him fronting this oven speaks to the way in which if you're extraordinarily stringent, there is a way in which that actually becomes opening up. It's a way that it becomes, you can be very flexible if you stay very, very close to the literal.
As long as I've meet the letter of the law and I know the details of it, I can tell you exactly. So I figured out exactly. That's why I'm so impressed with this inventor, Mr. Achnai, because he figured out how to make exactly the thing that gets around the laws, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, good. So in any event, in the story, Rabbi Eliezer is saying basically that this oven is good. It's not pure. It can't be made impure, or it's not impure. And the other rabbis, ultimately led by Rabbi Joshua, say that it's not, no, you can't do that. That's a workaround that doesn't work. And this oven is just like any other oven. It can be impure. And basically Rabbi Eliezer gets very upset. And so here I'm just going to share the screen here just so that we can see the text for folks who are at home. there is a Sefaria source sheet, so www.sefaria.org. It's in the notes for the Facebook post. It's going to be actually soon. There's going to be a page on the jewishlive.org website for this show. So it'll be www.jewishlive.org/Oral Talmud. And the Sefaria source sheet link will be there. That page is not up right now, but it will be very soon. And anyway, so you can follow along with this source sheet, and if you have it now, but if you don't, you can get it. And we're adding the text every time, to the text that we're talking about. So I'm just going to share my screen so that we see it a little bit here. And so they talk about this is the oven of Achnai, and the sages taught that Rabbi Eliezer, who wanted the oven to be considered pure or good, he gave all the possible answers in the world to support his opinion. But the other rabbis did not accept his arguments. And after he couldn't convince them logically, he moved to miracles. And he said, if the law is according to my opinion, this carob tree over here should prove it. And basically the carob tree gets up and walks across. I love how the rabbis are always arguing, well, the carob tree got up and walked. I mean, that would be itself a miracle, but then they have to argue, did it go 100 cubits or 400 cubits? And there's other texts that we're going to look at with similar arguments. Yeah.
So I think that's a really important point. Okay. Nobody disagreed about the fact that a miracle happened at Rabbi Eliezer's, invocation of it. Yeah, right. Everyone agrees a miracle happened. They're only arguing over how far the tree went. And right. And it's a really important point, because no one's saying prophecy is over. Yet this text, as we're about to see, I don't want to give away too much, it's a snapshot of the moment that, not that prophecy died, but the moment that the tradition said, yeah, but we're not going to listen to it. Yeah, prophecy happens. God still tells us what he wants, and we're not going to pay attention. So,
well, right. And what I had said was that let's try to read this text on two levels. One is where God is God, and the other where God is the tradition or the rabbis. Right. The version of that would be in our day would be if some genius of Talmudic knowledge, and not the kind that we're talking about, because we're talking more about meta ideas, but somebody who, that classic rabbi who could put a pin through the Talmud and know what letter it stopped on, right? I mean, that's the legendary great rabbis of the old country, whatever. And so that guy comes and says, I know what it is. I could show you. Yeah. It's on page 42, B. And basically we're going to, so here it's God making miracles. And in our version today, it would be somebody claiming, I know what the tradition tells. Yeah. Exactly. Right. And I can prove it to you through this proof. Right. So the first thing that Rabbi Eliezer does is that he has a carob tree walk around some number of cubits, and then, hold on, I'm just trying to make this a little bigger so that I don't know if it'll make a difference for folks seeing this at home, but and the rabbis say one does not cite proof from a carob tree, meaning, yeah, it was a miracle, but you can't prove a legal argument through a carob tree. And so then Rabbi Eliezer says to them, okay, if the law is according to my opinion, the stream should prove it. And the water in the stream turned backwards. And they said, one does not cite proof from a stream. Now, my question, I don't know if this is worth the conversation, but at the point at which they don't accept the law from a carob tree, why would they accept it from a stream? What, in other words, why does he keep trying with more and more miracles? But let's just go through the miracles and then we can discuss that. So then Rabbi Eliezer said, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall should prove it. And the walls started to cave in. And then Rabbi Joshua finally hops up and he scolds the walls and he says, basically, if Torah scholars are disputing over the law, what is it your business? And the walls then did not fall because of deference to Rabbi Joshua, but they don't also straighten up because of deference to Rabbi Eliezer. So that's very interesting. So, and then it becomes one of these kind of just so stories, and that's why the walls of the study hall are still slanted to this day, right? Because of this episode. So by the way, again, in the sort of critical, I wonder if there's any kind of academic scholar who studied this story and could tell us, actually, there was a study hall in Mechoza, or I guess it would be in Yavne, somewhere, whatever, that had these slanty walls, and probably there actually was a Gesso story to try to explain that. But in any event, the walls stay slanted, and then Rabbi Eliezer tries one more miracle, which he says, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, let heaven prove it. And then a divine voice, basically God, comes and says, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? The law is always according to Rabbi Eliezer. That's a principle in the Talmud, that when Rabbi Eliezer expresses an opinion, the law is always according to what he says. Because he's the plastered cistern that doesn't lose a drop. How could it be possible that he would ever be wrong? And in this case too, he's right. And Rabbi Josh, oh, go ahead.
Now, it's important to remember this moment when God himself, God itself says, Rabbi Eliezer is not only right here about this oven matter, every time he gives an opinion, he's right. He is completely in line with me. Everything he says is what I want, is as I would want it, because that the rabbis let God put that sort of characterization on Rabbi Eliezer, and they then use Rabbi Eliezer as a kind of symbolic sort of carrier of God's will. And they're going to, in other places in the Talmud, reject what Rabbi Eliezer says or radically change what Rabbi Eliezer meant, expecting you're going to know that God in this story said that Rabbi Eliezer is right and is doing what I want everywhere he says anything. And so it's a shorthand that the rabbis are going to use elsewhere in the Talmud to project this obviousness over their radical overturning of God and Torah. Okay, but anyway.
Okay, so put those on the list. We're making a list of future texts to look at, so we should look at those. That sounds very important.
Yeah.
So basically, right, God says we always agree with Rabbi Eliezer, and so I guess before we get to the punchline, any more that you want to say about the previous stuff?
I love what you brought out, the fact that once Rabbi Eliezer brings the carob trees and they say, no, we don't take proof from carob trees, why would he think that they're going to accept proof from any other miracle? I love that. And we should come back to that, because I think that's precisely at the root of why Rabbi Eliezer is so dangerous, and why what's going to happen to him happens to him, why he's so threatening to his colleagues. But finally he says, okay, fine, you don't believe in any of these miracle signs of God's will, let God himself tell you with his own words that I'm right about this oven. Okay. So here we are.
I do want to say one thing, though, that I think, like, as I reflect on, because I really feel we're going through a time right now. I mean, we have been for a century or two, but I mean, it's accelerating, and now this coronavirus period is like, it's just a super acceleration of it. But you see the Rabbi Eliezers of our day who are saying, like, what you're doing is not Judaism. Like, it's nice. I mean, I can understand how your, Zoom Seder is nice, nice, whatever, but that's not the way to do a Seder. That can't be the new way to do a Seder. It's not right. Right. And you're like, but wait a second, I really liked it. I was able to have my whole family together for the first time ever from every country, all these countries. Like, what's bad about it? Or, even more significantly, and we were talking about this with Amichai Levi earlier, that there, right, in Jewish law, like traditional Orthodox, let's say Jewish law, there's a requirement that you have to have 10 men in a physical room together to be able to say the mourner's Kaddish. Well, that can't happen anymore for a certain time. And people are like, first of all, a lot of people are dying, these days. And even if it was just the regular, what do you mean? I have to say the mourner's Kaddish. Like, I need it for myself. I need it for the person I've lost and I've loved. I mean, you can't tell me that I'm not going to say the mourner's Kaddish because of some arcane rule that 10 people have to be in the same room. I never even heard of that rule. And they're like, well, you're ignorant. You should have heard of that rule. They're going, no, but it can't be the rule. And so you have the Rabbi Eliezers of the world, I think, today saying, but the book says this, right. and the people of the world saying, but I need it to be different.
And the ones who say, hey, when we could have had 10 men in a room, very few of y'all were recognizing how problematic that idea was when we could have done it. To have 10 cisgendered men in a room, you're not even understanding menness. That whole idea was a problem, you know, even when it was quote unquote possible. Now, that's the crumble before the crash.
Right. But I
Okay.
think that the one thing about Rabbi Eliezer that in this question about why does he keep bringing another proof and another proof, that's how the folks who are in the position of Rabbi Eliezer would be and are today. And by the way, I don't say that disparagingly. They really believe that this is right, and I respect them. But they're saying, but it says it here, and 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 it says it here. And they're like, well, I didn't care that you said it the first time, so why do I care that you showed me 5 different places where it says it? You know, I need to say them more in Scottish, right?
And they're right.
They're right. Absolutely.
They're right. And what they're saying is, this is how it works. And what the others are saying is, not anymore, it doesn't.
Right.
You keep quoting from the old manual, and you're right. That's what the old manual says. But the problem here is that you're not recognizing that there's a new manual. And that's what's happening in this text. This is the story. This is the story of the creation of the new manual, and what happens to those who say, it says this in the old manual.
Right. The only slight thing that I would say about what you just said is that there isn't yet a new manual. That's part of the problem. It's that like there's an old manual versus a new something that one day will become a manual.
That's right. That's right.
But and for the people who love manuals, they're like, you can't compare the two. I have a manual over here, and I have a bunch of chaos over here.
That's good. That's right. That's right.
And you're like, yeah, but this is a time for chaos.
That's right.
And we'll have a new manual, don't worry. You know, but so something like that. But
I really appreciate that, because that's what makes it so difficult to respond to the guys pointing to the old manual, because they have something to point to.
Right.
And we don't have something to point to. And it's very hard to say, no, we think you're actually wrong, even though we don't have anywhere to point to except our svara. And that's why svara.
Exactly. So, okay, so let's go back into the story.
Okay.
I hope we're going to make it. We have 20 minutes left. Okay.
I know. And we got a lot to go.
We got a lot of good stuff here. So we can come back to this. Okay, so now we're back in the story, and the voice of God has said that Rabbi Eliezer is always right. It's not just that he's right here, he's always right. And Rabbi Joshua stands up and he says, quoting the book of Deuteronomy, he says, it is written, it is not in heaven, lo bashamayim hi. And the Talmud asked, what did he mean when he said that? Because he just got up and he said, lo bashamayim hi. You know, he didn't give a whole explanation. The Talmud then asked, well, what was he saying? What did he mean? And Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, I mean, you know, 1,000+ years before, we give no regard to a divine voice. As you God, you already wrote at Mount Sinai and the Torah, incline with the majority. So the bottom line here, you know, as my first take on it is, you know, and then to ask you, B'nai, to elucidate this more, but, you know, the take here is basically, God, you had one chance to talk to humans, and that was called Mount Sinai. You wrote, you know, you said, and then we wrote, or you wrote some, it got written, you know, it was oral, and then it got written, right? And you had one chance to say what your rules and regulations were. And you said, follow the majority. And here we have a majority saying different from what you say. And you don't get to come and say, oh, follow the majority, except when God comes and says a different opinion. You said, follow the majority. We're going to get to whether he really said that, but he's saying that you said, follow the majority. But basically there's just two things. One is that, you know, basically the claim here is that God, you got one chance to speak. And if you didn't speak the right way, if you made a mistake in how you spoke, tough luck, you know.
And the idea that we're saying that when God said it's not in heaven, that what God meant by that, which is not at all what the Torah meant by it, is that the authority for what is truth isn't in heaven, it's down on earth. And here we are on earth, the authority is no longer with you, it's with us. Okay. So that's move number one.
Right.
And then move number two is, as you said, in that Torah that you gave to us, which is now down here to make authority, to derive authority from, you said in that Torah, go with the majority. And we're a majority. So all of us around the table against you and Rabbi Eliezer. It's like, I don't know, probably a dozen against two. We win. And we're only following your rules.
And the one thing that I want to add to this from the perspective of, let's say, again, we talked about contract law last week, from constitutional laws, this is a classic constitutional interpretation type of question that we have in the American legal system. It's like, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, you had one chance to talk. And now we have to interpret what you said. And some people say, oh, but we see here in the Federalist Papers, what he really meant was, and we say, okay, well, some people accept that. But there are other people who say, no, the only thing that matters is the actual text of the Constitution. Maybe what we can try to interpret that text, because every text has to be interpreted. So it's not just that like there's a dead hand of the text, but it doesn't necessarily matter what Alexander Hamilton thought the text meant. It matters what we think the text meant. So this is a classic, this is not like some arcane Talmudic thing. This is a classic legal interpretation of a text with the binding authority of law, whether that's a constitution or a statute. And that's just how it is. That's what happens every single day in the American legal system. And what's going on here is they're basically saying, in the Constitution, it says, Congress shall make no law, right? And so what do you mean you're trying to make a law abridging freedom of speech? It says Congress shall make no law, and you're like, well, but it doesn't exactly mean that. It's like, well, then they should have written that. Right? And that's how it goes, and there are arguments against it, but that's what's going on here.
Right.
So I think that I guess the question is where to go with it next. Let's finish the story.
Well, do we want to bring out the fact that the two verses are obviously
we do, but let's just finish the story. Just to finish it, we might want to come back to it, but just to put an end cap on the story, because it's significant, is that basically this is what Rabbi Yirmiyah explains, what Rabbi Yehoshua is trying to say. And then the Talmud says, years later, a different rabbi, Rabbi Natan, encountered Elijah the prophet. Elijah is a character who's always going around because he didn't die. In the Bible, he was carried off by a chariot. So that's why he's always available to show up at our seders and do other kind of things. He's always running into people in the Talmud.
He's God's right-hand guy, so he knows what God's thinking all the time.
Yeah, but he's wandering around, like you run into him here and there. And Rabbi Natan,
I always imagine Rabbi Natan running into Elijah in heaven. I like your thing better.
So here's where I got the leg up on you, because I've been doing the daily Talmud page, and in the book in Masechet Brachot, there is a scene where somebody's just like outside of a ruin and they run into Eliyahu on the road. So he's all over, and so Rabbi Natan ran into Elijah the prophet and said to him basically, like, when this whole situation happened, and God's voice came down and said the law is always according to Rabbi Eliezer, so it should be here too. And Rabbi Yeshua had this whole business that he said it's not in heaven, and you said incline with the majority. And
when you lose, sit down.
Right. What did God do? What was God's reaction? And Elijah says, God smiled and said, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. In Hebrew, it's nitzchuni banai, nitzchuni banai. And it's a kind of there's a pride. I mean, you could read it in different ways. I read it as a little bit of pride and a little bit of melancholy. The repetition, nitzchuni banai, nitzchuni banai. That it's not. You could read it as celebratory, but I sort of read it as like, they got me.
I see it as a positive. I am not the first one to make this analogy, and I can't remember who shared it with me, but it's the pride actually of when your kid beats you in chess. It's
I get angry when that happens. No, I'm just kidding.
Maybe that's why you read God this way here.
Right.
No, it's like, you got me. You totally got me. Nice one.
Right.
I love it.
Right. So, okay. So I think we will make it to the end here. We've got 15 minutes, and we want to talk about the two important quotes, because this whole story, I think we're going to make it to the quotes. I think we're probably not going to make it to the big picture interpretation of this text. I think we will talk about that next week with David Kramer, and we'll continue it the following week. And basically, it's the theme of this whole show, whatever it is, podcast, gathering, show, whatever. So we're going to come back to this over and over again. But let's look at there are two quotes here that are given. One is that Rabbi Yehoshua stands up and he says, Lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in the heavens, and he's quoting the Torah there. And he's basically saying, with his quote, he's implying that what is not in the heavens means is that the decision-making power is no longer in the heavens. We get to decide now. And the explanation that Rabbi Yirmiyah gives is saying that specifically what he was saying was that it's not in the heavens, you gave all the rules, and now it's our interpretation, our interpretation that governs. And specifically what we're interpreting here is that there was one of the rules that you gave, God, in the Torah, was incline with the majority, follow the majority. And clearly here there's a majority, so boom, we win. And God, by the way, we have to say two things. One, God admits defeat in the story. So
Yes.
It's not like God is saying that was wrong to do that. God says,
Right.
you got me.
Right.
And number two is that remember that we're replacing God with the rabbis for our time, right? So meaning that if we can use the same jujitsu on the rabbis, then ostensibly the rabbis would be saying to us, you got me, right?
Yeah.
And in a good way, in a positive way. And I was just saying, I wasn't suggesting that it wasn't positive. I was saying, I think there's a little bit of melancholy to it.
Yeah.
And I think there probably would be there too. But either way, it's, you got me, you're right. We go your way, people. So go ahead.
So I don't know if you're going to keep going with the majority, but the verse in its context, what God actually said about the majority is, don't.
Yeah, so let's look. No, we're going to look at that text.
Okay, fine.
But so I don't want to spend too much time on the first text. It is not in the heavens. Right?
Yeah.
But it's in the source sheet. We're not trying to hide the ball here. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 to 16. I'm going to show it here in context, just like we did last week. We showed the quote in context, and it's not a complete misquotation like the next one is. It's what's happening here is God is kind of talking about the Torah, and he's saying like kind of the quote is, surely this instruction which I enjoin upon you this day is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea, basically, but it's in you, it's in your power. So I think that the basic understanding that I have in reading this text is that what this text is saying is that this Torah, don't worry, it's not that burdensome. You can do it. Like, it's not all this complex. It shouldn't be just for, rabbis it's simple enough that even you regular people you can know what it is and you can do it. And, don't worry, right? Something like that. It's not saying like, I'm never going to speak again.
Right. The interpretation that's important here is, what does the word "it" mean? It's right. In the context is clear that it means, right, this instruction, this whole Torah system, all of my laws, all of this is not far from you, beyond your reach to do and to live by. The Torah isn't in heaven. It's right there, available, accessible to you. Okay, good.
Right. Now you could make the argument that it's saying like, it's entrusting human beings with a power to interpret, to decide, to really carry an important weight, which Rabbi Joshua is suggesting. So it's not a complete misquotation. It seems a little bit not really what it is in context, but you could make an argument. But let's look at the second quote, because it's really the significant one. Because they're saying like, okay, but God, you gave us some rules. We take it seriously. Like, meaning if there's a rule in the Torah, we don't ignore that. In fact, we say if it's a clear rule in the Torah, we don't even have to worry, because it's very clear exactly what it is. So you can't come back and revise the rule. That's the part where you had one chance to speak, God, and like you can't write in the Torah, follow the majority, and then come down and say, don't follow the majority. The Torah says follow the majority, right? That is kind of what is being said here. So we say, okay, well, let's check it out. And so the quote that is being quoted here that says follow the majority is from the book of Exodus, chapter 23, verse 2. And so here it is in context. You must not carry false rumors. You shall not join hands with the guilty to act as a malicious witness. Do not follow the crowd to do wrong. And when you give testimony, do not follow the majority. Do not incline with the majority to intervene in a dispute to pervert justice, nor shall you show deference to a poor man in his dispute. So two things. One, the context here is talking about basically criminal law and bearing false witness. It's a completely different context from what's going on here in terms of pure ovens. And the other point, and probably the more significant ones, it says, do not follow the majority. It says, do not follow the majority to do wrong. Do not follow the majority to intervene in a dispute and pervert justice. Now, you could say by implication, that means follow the majority in everything else. but it certainly does not say that. And the quote is basically ... follow the majority, right? And the ... is do not. I mean, that is the worst possible form of misquotation that you could imagine. I mean, you would get an immediate F in college for a piece of work like that.
Right. And the funny thing is they're quoting God. They're misquoting God to God.
Right.
As if God doesn't know what God said. It's funny.
And God says, you got me.
Yeah.
So
nice one. Nice one. It's like, good. Go with that. I think he's saying
right.
that's great.
I mean, so I think though that there's two key points, right? One, and the one where, in a normal circumstance, I think we would spend the next hour talking about, well, what's up with God here? Why is God saying that you can misquote God to God and it's still okay? And we should, that's an important conversation. We should have that conversation. But I think that to return where we were last week about the previous text, if we're saying that what's really happening here is the rabbis saying everybody who can read at the time that this is written knows that this is a misquotation. Everybody who can read has read. There's very few people who can read. So everybody who can read is highly educated, highly knowledgeable, and knows that this is a misquotation and knows what is going on here in sort of every respect. And that means that in a time 2,000 years into the future, when lots more people can read, there isn't an attempt to hide anything here. So what we discover in the text now is what they were trying to say. And what they were trying to say goes as much for them as it goes for God. And so I think that what this has to mean is basically that they are saying, if a time should come in the future where you feel that what we have written explicitly in our book here doesn't work for your society for whatever reason, and you need to go in another direction, and you even have to go as far as misquoting us in order to get there, you got me, you got us. Like that has to be the message of this text, right?
Yeah, I agree completely. It's the moment of not only shifting to a new way of doing business, let's not forget that what happens right after this point in the story is that they excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer.
Mm-hmm.
And which is why this story on its surface is located here, because it causes him enormous pain. And
they excommunicate him because he becomes destructive. He's so angry, right?
Yeah, that his insistence on following the old set of rules, to us it's old, to them it's the current set of rules, right. As you point out, he's recognized this so fatal to the future, so dangerous to the future that they envision and that they want, that he has to be eliminated. They have to create a future without him.
Which is tragic on many levels, including the fact that Rabbi Eliezer is not he's not from the old guard, actually. That's a really significant thing, right? He is one of, like you said, he's one of the two students of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai.
It's not like he's a priest. He's not a priest.
He's not a priest. He's not a Sadducee. He's right. He's on the conservative end of the progressive wing, right? He's I don't know, Pete Buttigieg. I mean, right? Like he's not a liberal. I mean, he's not a conservative. He's not he's a conservative end of the progressives, right? So, and at a certain point, like even that is, so he, right. And again, I think it's sort of interesting to look around our world today and see, where do we see that? Where, we're already talking, the temple's already been destroyed. This is actually long after that. And we're looking at a time in which the liberals have already won in a way, in the sense of that.
What you're reminding me of, you and I are always asking ourselves, are we option 3? Are they option 3? Who's option 3? And the Jewish world has caught on to the necessity for and the positiveness of innovation, right? There's a lot of funding for innovation, and Rabbi Eliezer was an innovator too.
Right, absolutely.
He definitely was in on the innovation, but those who were you know, further on the cutting edge, we're saying to him, you know what, your innovation it's not bold enough, and it's not going to allow us to go as far as we want.
Well, and that at the point at which we start going bolder and you try to pull us back from that, and then first of all we're gonna do some stuff to not let you win, right? And God approves of that, and ultimately it means the rabbis approve of what we might do in our time. But then you're gonna go crazy and you're gonna start being destructive.
Yeah.
At that point, with a heavy heart, we have to cut you off because you're gonna destroy what you actually were part of the creation of.
Yeah.
So I think that we're out of time for this, and I want to respect that time. I think you and I will figure out whether we want to come back to this text and maybe also talk about that text of what happened with Rabbi Eliezer. I think it's a great text. We were going to have a different text next time, but maybe we should have this one in between. We'll figure that out.
Yeah.
We'll continue to pick this up with David Kramer next week. We're both super excited that next week's guest is Professor David Kramer from the Jewish Theological Seminary, who is B'nai's Talmud teacher, has written a number of important books about the Talmud, including the just recently published History of the Talmud, which we're going to talk about some next week. And we're really excited about that. And then we're going to, the following week, which is I think April 30th, we're going to be back with continuing a session like this with an important text. And then the week after that, we're going to have another guest, et cetera, et cetera. Any last words, B'nai? I mean, for tonight?
Not for today. I'll let you take us home.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching with us. We are so, I don't know, I'm loving doing this with you, B'nai, and I hope that this is something valuable for folks. And I really, I guess I'll say that very soon there's going to be a page on the Jewish Live website. So it'll be www.jewishlive.org/Oral Talmud. And that's going to be the page where all the previous episodes are kept. In the interim, right now, there's already a page that's www.jewishlive.org/originals, where we have all the episodes that we've done of a number of different shows. And so our previous episodes are already there. So if you've enjoyed today, but you missed the last couple, then you can catch up, and that would be a great thing to do. And then we'll all be with David Kramer together. So B'nai, thank you so much for spending another hour with us.
Thank you. This is fun.
Okay.